Welcome to our first video on the instruments of the orchestra beyond the introductory video. If you have not yet watched the introductory video, make sure you go back and watch that first. We're going to be dealing with the string section of the orchestra first. One note again about the strings is that they are the largest section by number of players. Usually they make up almost half of the orchestra, or sometimes actually a little more than half, depending on the orchestra. We're going to be looking at the standard ones, which are all in the violin family. These are the only standard string instruments you'll find in the orchestra. And by that I mean, whenever I say standard instruments for this series, understand those are ones you can expect in any orchestra at pretty much any given time. We do have the non-standard instruments, which may make appearances depending on what kind of music they're playing, but you don't really expect them to always be instituted. We're going to look at the violin first of all. It is the smallest of the family, the subfamily that is the violin family of instruments. You'll notice that all four of these standard violin family instruments have the same basic shape as far as the body. They have a neck that includes the fingerboard where they place the left-hand fingers. They have the tuning pegs here. They have what they're called the F holes here that allow for better resonance, and they can be played with the bow, although we are going to learn that they can also pluck or do what's called pizzicato. Pizzicato is what it's called when they pluck the strings with their fingers. But they usually play with the bow in the orchestra. They all have four strings, which are made out of steel in modern day. There are strings that are made out of gut, and there's a video on Blackboard that explains what those gut strings are and how they're made and stuff. They are not made out of cat gut, as you often hear them called. It's actually lamb intestines that they took a collagen fiber from and fashioned strings. But modern day violins usually use steel strings. There's not a huge amount of difference in the sound between them. You really have to kind of listen carefully to hear a noticeable difference. So she is applying the bow here, which is actually coated with a substance called rosin. Rosin is taken from tree resin, and it's actually giving some grip. Otherwise, her bow, which the part that comes in contact with the strings is actually made out of horsehair. And that would just kind of glide across the strings, but adding that rosin gives it some friction, because if you recall from your textbook, all sounds are caused by vibrations. So she is causing one of the four strings to vibrate. She determines which string to play by the angle of the bow, because unlike a guitar where all the strings are laid out flat, the violin family of instruments have a semicircle shape to it, so each string is at a different elevation level. She is able to change pitch one of two ways. She can either play on the lower strings, which are thicker, or she can play on the upper strings, like this top E string here, which is the thinnest. The second way is by pressing her fingers down here, and what happens is when she causes the string to vibrate, if she's not touching the string, then this entire length of this string is vibrating. But when she puts her finger down, only now this part of the string is vibrating, which a shorter string vibrating produces a higher pitch. And if she lifts her finger up, it can then return to a lower pitch. So let's hear what one sounds like, in case if you've never heard a violin by itself. Hopefully you noticed that as she was going up, she was not only changing the angle of her bow, like I said she would, but her fingers were also going up, making the pitch higher. I do apologize if this DVD has a little bit low audio level. I've got it cranked as high as I can, unfortunately. But you should be able to hear as she goes down the scale. You should be able to hear and see that the pitches are lowered by her fingers and changing the angle of the bow. All right, so that does it for the violin. The violin is one of the more difficult instruments to play because, let me go back to this video here, because you can see there's no frets like there would be on a acoustic guitar, which ensure that you're going to be stopping the vibrations at an exact point. Instead, a violinist must use their ears. They must make sure that they have good muscle memory and practice a whole lot when they first start out, because if you don't press it and really the correct place, then you don't play the right note. So it does allow them to do things like slides where they're able to slide their finger up and produce effects and stuff like that. But and actually the ancestor instrument to all these instruments was one of them was the viola da gamba, which actually did have frets on it like a guitar, but eventually around the 1600s and stuff they lost that, and we started having the modern day violin, viola, cello, and bass. The viola is often confused with the violin. It is pronounced viola, not viola. People with the name that's spelled identically are usually called viola. So viola is this instrument here, so don't make the mistake to mispronounce it. You notice there's a very similar shape and size. There's only a few inches difference in the viola and violin. So you should think of the viola as like the alto voice in the string section, whereas the violin is the soprano, obviously. The viola is a little bit longer. It has a little bit of a darker tone to it, and the strings, it shares 3 strings with the violin, but the 4th string, instead of being a high string, is a low string, so it can play lower pitches. But you can hear it sounds very similar. It's played very similar to the violin, but they usually take care of more harmonic parts. It's more often for the violins to be playing the melody. Now you will notice, for the most part, she is playing a single string at a time. However, throughout that little clip, and you can back it up to see, she does play 2 strings simultaneously, and we call that double stopping. On any of these string instruments, when they do that, it's called double stopping. That's usually done more in a solo piece than it is necessarily done when you're playing as an ensemble or for orchestra. So do note that you do hear that a lot more often with solo stuff. All right, the next instrument is the cello. Now, once you get to the cello, it gets too large to be held underneath the chin. It must rest between the knees of the performer. There's a little metal rod called a spike that sticks out of the bottom. But it still has the same basic shape as the violin. It still has the F-holes. It still has 4 strings. Still has the tuning pegs with the scroll on top. And it still has a fretless fingerboard. Still play with the bow for the most part. But the cello has more of a tenor range, and it's a very beautiful sounding instrument. It's one of the more common ones to be heard, and if you've got that tenor level solo, it's a very good instrument for that, and we'll just let you hear it in case you've never heard one before. All right, and if you notice, she was rocking her hand back and forth a few times when she would play longer notes, and that's an effect that is called vibrato. That's mentioned in your textbook. That's just a warming of the tone. It's just like the human voice. If you hold a single note and you don't fluctuate that note, it kind of starts to wear on your ears a little bit. So they warm it up by slightly raising and lower the pitch. It's just a very slight change of pitch, and that adds a little warmth to the tone. And so you'll see all the string instruments doing that in the violin family. And lastly, we have the bass, which I call the William of the orchestra. And the reason I do that, because people that are called William, you can call them Bill, Will, Billy, Willie. I mean, they've got all different kinds of names. So I'm going to go over just a few quick names that people refer to this as. They call it the bass. They call it the Contra Bass. Contra in Italian means double, so it's also called the double bass. It's also called the acoustic bass or the upright bass. And it's one of those that is actually played quite a bit outside of classical music. Albeit when it's played in jazz and rock and stuff like that, they usually pluck the string or pizzicato and don't play it with the bow. So here is the bass being played. As you can see, it's very tall. Usually the performer has to stand up or be up on a tall stool. If you see him sitting all the way down in a chair, that's a cello. That's an easy way to tell the two apart. And so the standard bass is somewhere around 6 feet tall, and it still has the same basic features as a standard violin does. 4 strings, basic shape. We have the scroll up here with the tuning pegs, the F holes, things like that. But let's hear what one sounds like so you can hear the range of it. Okay, so again, this instrument has many different names. It is used a lot outside of classical music. You often see it in jazz and things like that. Let's revisit what all these look like when they're on the stage. And as you can see, the strings do dominate the orchestra. Here we have the violins. And one thing I forgot to mention about the violins is that they're often split into 2 sections. First violins are here and second violins are there. And there's usually more violins than there is any other instrument in the orchestra. Then you have your violas, which are usually kind of towards the front of the conductor. Then the cellos, I started to combine 2 different plural ways of saying that. Let's talk about how you say the plural of cello. You can say celli, which is the Italian way, or cellos is the accepted American pronunciation of that. I'm going to stick with probably cellos. I think my education was trying to kick in there and tell me, no, it's celli, but there's no real wrong way to say it in America, because we kind of make up our own language over here. So we're going to just say cellos, because that way you guys will know what I'm talking about better. But if you do hear someone say celli, you know what they're talking about. All right, then you have your basses over here. And as you can see, the cellos are sitting down all the way in chairs, and then your bass players have these really high stools, or either they're standing up all the way. Now, one thing you will hear me mention in all of these families and all the different instrument sections is sometimes I'll refer to someone as being a principal player, and that's P-A-L on the end, like your principal at school. The principal is like the leader of their section. They have extra responsibilities. Oftentimes they have to oversee any repair work that needs to be done to any of the instruments. For instance, if this guy right here is the principal, trumpet player, then if one of these guys has a trumpet that breaks and it's the orchestra's property, then they will oversee the repair cost and the work order and stuff like that. It all depends on what the structure of the orchestra is. But they do usually have extra roles, making sure everybody has sheet music that they need. And sometimes, like you see in the tuba position here, tubas, there's usually only one in an orchestra. And so he's kind of gets to be the unelected leader of his section. He has no competition. But let's say you have a piece of music where this orchestra needs 4 tubas for it. Well, then he may have to oversee contracting and contacting other tubists to bring in. The only one that's not called principal is the first violin principal player. And we give them a special name. If it's a man, as in the case here, you call it the concert master. If it's a female, it's concert mistress. And sometimes that's spelled as 2 different words, but oftentimes you will see it spelled as a single word, because it comes from the German word Concertmeister. And that is all one word in German. And if you ever go see an orchestra in concert, then everybody will be out on stage kind of warming their instruments up. The concertmaster will then come out, and that's how you know when the concert's about to start. If they don't dim the lights or say an announcement or something, you'll clap for the concert master. They'll usually take a bow, point to the oboe. The oboe will tune the orchestra. Then he'll sit down and signal to the conductor that the orchestra is tuned and is ready to go. And that's when the conductor comes out. Another round of applause, another bow. And then the conductor may say something, or just simply turn around and start conducting the orchestra and bringing them in. So this is the concertmaster or mistress position, and that's the only special principal. There's all the other positions usually have a principal player. All right, so that does it for the standard instruments that we have seen in the orchestra as far as the strings go. Now there are 2 strings in the stringed instruments that we are going to look at that are called non-standard. And I'd like to remind you what your textbook says as far as how we classify those instruments as either strings, woodwinds, brass, or percussion. Keep in mind that just simply having strings on the instrument does not automatically qualify it as a string instrument. That's usually the case, but like in the case of the piano has strings in it, but it's actually classified in another family. So the way we classify strings is that they, of course, have to have strings, but those strings have to be played in one of three ways: bowed, like the violins; strummed, or plucked, like we're going to see with the guitar and harp. Now, the harp, many people feel like the harp is like one of those standard instruments in the orchestra, but in fact, you will find that the orchestral harp is not always there. Many of the concerts I've been to of orchestral music, I've never once, saw throughout the whole concert a harp player there. A few of them I have. Even one of them, the harp player, only needed to be there up until intermission, and then she packed up and left. But the orchestral harp has 47 strings on it, and it looks like some of the strings are missing, and that's because some of the strings actually have colored thread woven into them to indicate certain notes, because without certain notes indicated, it would be very confusing to find a specific pitch. And I can't remember which one's which, but one is blue usually, and the other's red. I think all the C's are red. I may be wrong on that. All the blues are F's, and then so if you want to find a note G, you find the blue string, and then go to the note above that. I'm sorry, the note above that would be G. If you want to find the note below that, which would be E, then you go to the longer string. Obviously, the big long strings down here produce lower pitches, and as they go up, they produce higher pitches. So here is what a harp sounds like, and you can see that it's not just played by strumming up and down, although you will hear those, what they're called are glissandos. You will hear glissandos a lot. It's an effect that it can do, but the harp can also be played sort of like a piano, where you play the melody in one hand and the harmony in the other. Alright, so harps, like we said, aren't standard. Sometimes they play with the orchestra, sometimes they play solo or accompany a singer or something. We're going to move on now to the guitar. Now, the guitar that you see here is not a standard acoustic guitar. It's actually what we call a classical guitar. The other one's an acoustic or folk guitar. It has a slimmer neck and fingerboard, and usually the strings are made out of steel. In the case of the classical guitar, you have a thick, wide fingerboard that allows for a little bit more agility of fingering, and then you also have, I'm not sure if this one does because it really is not very consistent, but I do see a lot of them use the gut strings or nylon. Some people are objected to using lamb intestines, so they use nylon, although most are pretty picky about what kind of strings they use. Now, classical guitar playing is it's more in a picking style than it is strumming and let's sing a song kind of style. So that's kind of what you're going to hear with this. The recording on this particular piece it's a little messed up. So if you hear any unusual popping or something, that's just a defect in the DVD. But let's hear what a classical guitar sounds like. pretty amazing stuff. It sounds almost like two guitars playing at once. But that's kind of just a little sample there of what classical guitar is. And usually when you see an orchestra, playing with a guitar, it's usually that. Although it's in today's day and age, it's nothing to see Metallica, on their electric guitars playing with an orchestra.